Welcome back to the channel from Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, as I began a new series of videos from Central Asia. This is a vast region whose countries you may have heard of from school days as the Stans because of the endings of their names: Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, etc. It's a part of the world with some of the oldest and most colorful cultures on Earth, but that Westerners tend to know little about. I'll be traveling in 3 of these Central Asian countries during this trip, mostly following the Silk Road, the ancient trade route that connected China with Europe. Whatever mental image you may have of Almaty, I'm going to guess that, like me, if you were to come here, you'd be surprised. This is a city of 2 million people that's leafy and green, and at the foot of the lofty Tian Shan Mountains in the far southeast of the country, near its border with Kyrgyzstan. Since this video is being shown for the first time in January, let's be clear about something. My visit to the region was in late summer and early fall. In January, Almaty is covered in snow, and the temperature rarely rises above freezing. In fact, the farther north you go in Kazakhstan, the colder it gets, with winter temperatures in the capital, Astana, often dipping as low as minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So don't rush out and buy a plane ticket. I should tell you that Kazakhstan came into existence as an independent nation in 1991 following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Almaty was Kazakhstan's capital until the capital was moved to the new centrally planned high desert city, now called Astana. But long before that, when it was known as Almaty, today's Almaty was first the capital of the Autonomous Republic of Kazakhstan, as far back as 1929, and of the Union Republic of the same name until the USSR's going belly up. It's impossible to talk about Almaty and Kazakhstan's history without talking about the USSR. I've come to one of the loveliest of Almaty's public parks, which happens to be around the corner from the apartment where I'm staying. This park reminds us that this country, despite its independence, is in a sense still hostage to the history of the old Soviet Union. The massive war memorial that you see behind me, like a lot of monuments in this town and in this country, is a Soviet monument. This one ostensibly honoring Soviets from each of the 15 republics of the old USSR who defended Moscow from the Germans during World War II. Prominent among them were 28 soldiers of an Almaty infantry division, whose leader this park is named after, Ivan Panfilov, the commander of a group that was allegedly the linchpin of Moscow's being saved from the Germans. As the story goes, the 28 so-called fallen heroes were able to ward off the invasion of Moscow long enough for other forces to mobilize in the city's defense. The story was Soviet propaganda that was largely made up. Even the State Archive of the Russian Federation has acknowledged as much. Yet suggestions that the name of this park be changed have fallen on deaf ears. Independence or not, there isn't an appetite for doing anything that might offend Moscow today. Another vivid connection to Russia in this park is the possibly most beautiful building in all of Almaty that sits in the center of it. This is Ascension Cathedral of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was completed in 1907 during the final years of the Russian tzars. This church is among the tallest wooden buildings in the world, and it was constructed without the use of a single nail. Yet it survived the 1911 earthquake that decimated much of the city, something that Russian Orthodox clergy have long promoted as divine intervention. I'm headed toward the so-called Green Bazaar. The bazaar is Almaty's most famous market, and it's popularly called the Green Bazaar because someone once upon a time decided to paint the building green. The street here is rapidly filling up. I suspect in a short while even the sort of semi parking lot where I'm walking will be bumper to bumper in people. Some beautiful looking peaches here, along with plums and grapes. If that price is 600 ting, you're talking about a little over 2 pounds of peaches for about $1.25. I've read where there's not supposed to be any photography inside the building, so I may be on thin ice here, but there's only one way to find out. I've met with no resistance. What I see is an extremely clean place and a very orderly place. I just passed through the door and immediately was confronted with all sorts of fruits and nuts.
Very nice.
Behind me, and I've made my way to the meat section because I wanted to show you something, and that is there's lots of horse meat here. Horse is a very popular meat in Kazakhstan, and although you can't really read the Cyrillic writing describing it, there's no doubt about what's what because of the signage, and I'll show you. You can see it's a picture of a horse, and I suppose the word beneath it, which I cannot read, says horse, but there are at least 6 long sections of horse meat, and I think I walked upon a section of horse meat sausages. I see these nice ladies are still hanging the sausages. Hello. I don't believe I've ever eaten horse meat. I've seen it before in Mexico, among other places, so I don't know how it tastes. But in terms of how it looks in the meat market, all I can say is it looks very fresh here. Over the long rows of dairy products, there's plenty of Kymis, that's K-Y-M-Y-S, and that means it's fermented horse milk. And you've got your shumat, that's fermented camel milk. And of course there's lots of more traditional stuff, cream and cream cheese, yogurt, kefir. It's all here. The problem is that with anything that I don't readily recognize, I can't very well tell what it is because of the alphabet. Shopping here for locals is a daily tradition. Things here are served fresh, as in most places that have public marketplaces. If you want fresh meat or dairy products, fresh fruits and vegetables, you just make a trip to the market. Almaty is very proud of its apples. This region of Kazakhstan is one of the premier apple growing regions in the world. In fact, the cultivar of commercial grade apples worldwide is thought to have originated in this region. Apples have long been a part of this area's food history. This is a diverse city, the most ethnically diverse city in Kazakhstan. You can see that in this market. Different ethnicities are associated with different product lines. For example, most of the women that you see selling pig lard here, and you can get smoked or salted, are of Ukrainian background, whereas Tajiks have more or less cornered the market on nuts and dried fruits. And women of Korean descent serve up all kinds of Korean salads. There's an entire section of Uyghur merchants who have stalls across the street. So just a real mix of people. I've gotten off the metro in an upscale area of the city. This is Panfilov Street, named for the same military commander after whom the city's most prominent park is named. The one thing that's noticeably absent on a street like this are lots of outdoor cafes, and that's for a very simple reason, and that's because of the extreme seasonality of this city. The winters being so cold, the summers being relatively short, but there are plenty of coffee shops here. They're just behind doors. The imposing building behind me at the head of Panfilov Street is the city's opera house, home to both the National Opera and the National Ballet. Built in the 1930s, Soviet Union days, it's an example of Stalinist architecture, blending classical Greek columns with Oriental arches. The building's ornaments are Kazakh. The imagery is Soviet. The sides of this opera house are flanked by beautiful parks, which, like so many in Almaty, are filled with water features, lots of leafy walkways, and plenty of benches to sit, which is one of the reasons why the city surprised me. It certainly feels like more of a European city than I anticipated. This entire area around the opera house is really an exquisite neighborhood where important artists and writers, powerful politicians and military people have lived for a very long time, before, during, and after the Soviet era. In some of the streets just to the north of where I am, I noticed that some of the fine remaining historical wooden homes have been painted in bright colors. I suppose they always were. And for the same reason that you find that in St. Petersburg in Russia, that is to make the place more cheerful during the long, bleak winters. There are a sizable number of ethnic Koreans in Kazakhstan and neighboring Uzbekistan, for that matter. The reason for this is that during the heyday of the Stalin regime in the USSR, the Kremlin forcibly removed different ethnic groups to different parts of the country to suit their whim. And in case of the Koreans who had immigrated to the far east of Russia, many of them were shipped off to Central Asia. There were about 100,000 people of Korean descent who live in Kazakhstan, and a bit more in neighboring Uzbekistan. Among them were the ancestors of one Victor Tsoi, whose rock band Kino was a Soviet counterculture phenomenon in the 1980s. Tsoi died in a car crash in 1990, but not before cementing his legend in a bleak movie that captured the tenor of the times. Its title in English is Needles. It was filmed partly in his native south-central Kazakhstan and partly in Almaty. In fact, the final scene was shot on this street where this monument now stands in his memory. This is Republic Square, or sometimes referred to as Independence Square, one of the most politically symbolic places in a city with plenty of political symbolism. This site has been a site of mass protest demonstrations, both before the dissolution of the Soviet Union and afterward. In one of those demonstrations, late in the USSR's life, 1986, the authorities brought in troops and more than 200 people were killed. And the square has been the source of agitation even more recently. In 2022, there were demonstrations here in which the first president of Kazakhstan's residence was burned, along with the mayor's office. Having read about this place, I came here as much out of curiosity to see it as anything else. When you look at the museum site that's cut off from the rest of the square by the thoroughfare that runs between it, you see that on the other side of the thoroughfare there's a giant flower shop and a pizzeria and other businesses over there that take up prominent space close to the museum. And underground there's a whole mall of shops and restaurants. Above ground, of course, is another story. This place is carved up and placed on multiple levels so that you almost literally have to watch where you're going before falling down steps, surrounded, as it always has been, by the signature brutalist architecture of the former Soviet Union. The buildings that you see here, office buildings, apartment buildings, give it a distinctly old world look, and making the rest of it sort of stand out as a modernist answer to that look. If you like the sound of water and fountains, the space here that once could have been utilized by people has been eliminated with the water features. Another strategy of the government's trying to bring this place to heel as a place of mass demonstration.
Next from Kazakhstan, from high mountains to high desert along the country's border with China.
The climate in the Taran Canyon is so dry, hot, and windy.
Yeah.
Like a humid something like this.
Absolutely.